In this brief tutorial, I'm going to introduce you to some of the most important aspects of Tinkercad in the context of helping you design your own invention. So when you open Tinkercad for the first time, to create an object, you will be introduced to this work plane. So the work plane is where all your objects are going to be put on and created. You can control the orientation of the object by clicking on this top left icon here. If I click on top, it gives me a top view. I can scroll through the different views, for example the right view and so on. So I'm going to go back to something that allows us to view the object in 3D, looking at it from the top and from the right side. Okay. Now the next thing is to be able to add objects to this work plane, right? So I'm going to just reorient it a little bit, and on your right side here you see a variety of icons. For example, you see basic shapes, you have shape generators, circuits, printables. I'm going to focus on Tinkercad and the process of creating shapes and creating objects and adding them together, right? So I'm going to just go back to the basic shapes and add an object by just dragging it onto the work plane. You can see that this is a cylinder. It's a solid cylinder whose color I can change by clicking here, and also you have an option here of creating a hole. So this is an empty object. Okay, so let's go back to the solid for now. Okay, so now you can see that this object has several handles here. For example, this little curved arrow here allows me to rotate the object in this plane, right? Similarly, the arrow here allows me to rotate the object in that vertical plane. And so you can play around with these controls. This control here simply allows me to change the size of the object, right? So you can see several things happening to it as I move by holding this corner button with my cursor. The dimensions that are shown here are in millimeters. Okay, so that's the first thing you should become comfortable doing. Now that you've added an object and you know how to control its size and its orientation, for example with this angle button here, let's go ahead and add another object to this plane. And now I'm going to show you how you can align different objects, right? So let's say I want to put this box on top of my cylinder in such a way that the two faces are completely aligned with each other. Okay? So how do I do that? Well, first thing is to click on one object and using the shift key click on the other object so that you have selected both, and then go up to the top here and you will see this little icon here that says align, and I'm going to click the align button. And what that gives you now is that it gives you different options of aligning the two objects. Okay, so this is aligning it in the vertical plane, and this is aligning it with respect to a particular position on the object. So let's click on this and see what happens. Okay, now you see that the two are aligned with their centers along the long direction of this work plane. Now I'm going to click here. Now you see that they're aligned along the X and Y centers, and then I'm going to maybe click on this one here. What you see now is that the box is completely aligned in the plane. Let me go back and select these two again. I'm going to just draw a square around it. These are aligned again, and get my align controls back, and you can see the ones that are grayed out are not available anymore because now these two are completely aligned. So I'm just going to change the alignment here for a moment and show a different alignment of the two. So getting used to this alignment operation is something that is going to be very useful for you as you go forward. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do now, let me pull this back out, is I want to make a hole in an object. Okay, so if you remember right in the beginning, we said that you could select a color or you could create an empty object. Well, an empty object by itself is nothing, but when an empty object is in a solid object, then that becomes a hole. So let's see how we can create a square hole in this round object. So I'm going to go back to this, select a solid, and I'm going to do this, create a hole, and I'm going to just move it into this. Okay, so now we have these two objects, and one is an empty space and the other is a solid object, but this doesn't mean that there is a hole in our solid object, right? So because if I move it out, there's no hole there, right? So in order to create a hole, now what I do is I select both these objects, so they were selected, and then I say group. Okay, so now when I've grouped it, you see now when I move it around that your solid object now has a hole in it. Okay, so we now have created a hole in a solid object. Okay, so now let's go to the next item, and that is aligning objects using a slightly different technique. So I'm going to add a bunch of things here. So let me start with this cube and this roof and this cone. Okay, and let's say first I want to align my cone on top of this cube. So as you can see, just by trying to align it physically by looking at it is a very difficult task. Okay, so here's another way to do it. So what you do is you start with your object here, or rather you start by clicking on this work plane button here, and what that does is it gives you a temporary work plane that you can put on any object face that you want. So for example, if I look at what's happening here, this work plane is now oriented on the top face of my cube, so I'm just going to click it there. So now I have a temporary work plane, and now I'm going to take my object here, and let me do it this way. Let me delete these objects right now. Now I'm going to take my roof here, and I put it on my work plane, and this is going to be aligned. Okay, so now I click back on the work plane, bring it back here and click, and I have now aligned those two objects. Okay, so now let's see how to align another one on this curved surface. So let's look at it from a slightly different view here. There you go. So you can see I'm just going to align it better here, and that's it. Now I want to align this cone on the surface here of this roof. Let's go back again to the work plane, and now I'm going to attach a work plane here, and now I'm going to get my my cone, and you can see that the cone is oriented such that it is now pointed in the direction parallel to the work plane surface, and then I click on my work plane again, and there you go. So that's how you can do this. Okay, so now of course when I move it out, it's not going to be aligned perfectly on the surface, but in the previous step, if I put it on the work plane, it would have been aligned. Okay, so that's how you can align different objects. All right, the final item I want to show you is something called extrusion. Now what you can see here is that you see these various objects on the right side of fairly common shapes. But let's say you want to make a really complicated shape. Let's say you want to make a car that has a very complex looking body. So in order to do that, the best tool to use is one of the shape generator tools. So I'm going to click on the featured shape generators and click on the extrusion button and drag the object here. So when you apply the extrusion button, you now show there's now a new window here on the right side that basically allows you to control the shape. So these are the handles that determine the tangent of the shape, so you can control the angles between where those lines are meeting. And I'm going to try and create something that looks like a little, maybe a fancy looking car, something like this. So you can see now that my shape has been so when I click on this, you can see that this is an extrusion shape, and I have a particular shape here. So extrusion is basically the fact that you can take this 2D shape and basically create a 3D shape with it, right? So that's the extrusion process, except that extrusion allows you to create a very complicated looking shape as you have here. Okay, you can adjust it any way you want, and I bet you that this would be the tool that will really help you design a fancy looking car, for example when you're working on your design project for a balloon powered car. Okay, so that is the basics. Please watch the videos, and along with the videos you should now have a good starting point to get started with using Tinkercad. Thank you for watching.